Hello, my name is Melissa Cherry, and myself, along with Sydney Basey and Trina Banks, were chosen to do a presentation on the female reproductive system. Today I'll be covering the ovarian cycle and the hormones that are involved in the female reproductive system. If you look at slide 1, I have the graphic here that correlates with slide 1. It gives us the 28 days, which is the average of the female reproductive system, and what happens on each day. I do feel like it is important to define what a follicle is for the terms here, as it is used often. And a follicle is a spherical structure that contains an oocyte surrounded by one or more layers of follicle cells. If you notice that on step 1 is the primary follicle, contains the primary oocyte, and the follicle cells secrete the sex hormone estrogen. That is the first step in the female reproductive system, and if you can see, it is demonstrated here with the follicle cells and the primary oocyte. That happens on day 1 of the ovarian cycle. It is also important to state that when a female is born, she contains all of the eggs that she will have for her entire life, although they will not mature until she reaches puberty. The body is preparing for the eggs prior to birth even. At birth, most females have 700,000 eggs, or roughly 700,000 eggs. By the time that they reach menopause, only 400 to 500 of those eggs have reached maturation. And that's a very staggering number. I think it gives you kind of a clue as to how many eggs that are in a female's body and how important the ovarian cycle is to a female. The next step in the ovarian cycle is the follicle maturation. That when the follicle cells, they divide in this step, and they continue, the fluid accumulates between the cells, and it splits them into 2 layers. Of those 2 layers, one is an inner cell that directly contains the oocyte, and the other cell takes a balloon form, and it encloses the oocyte in the fluid, kind of like a protective covering. During this stage is also when the most rapid growth occurs during the ovarian cycle. If you move on to step 3, and that's the formation of the mature follicle, and the mature follicle can also be called a Graafian follicle. That name will be used again later on, so just so you know, it is a Graafian follicle or a mature follicle. It can be called either one. Step 3, the maturation of the Graafian follicle. It occurs between 10 and 14 days. It results from the rapid growth from step 2, from follicle maturation. This is where meiosis forms the second oocyte and also the polar body. After this formation, there's 2 cells that are formed during this time. The cells are of unequal size. The larger cell, which is called the secondary oocyte, contains the cytoplasm and the nutrients. The tinier cell, which is called a polar body, is essentially the garbage bag for one of the sets of chromosomes that was not used in formation. Once that polar body is formed, it plays no further role in the ovarian cycle. It's just kind of set aside. Like I said, it's just kind of a trash type. Our next step would be ovulation. That typically occurs around 14 days, and that's when the mature follicle ruptures and releases the secondary oocyte, which is shown here. The rupture actually occurs 12 hours following the second oocyte. The mass of the oocyte is approximately the size of a pinhead, so it's extremely small. This is also where the egg forms, and it's a part of ovulation. If the sperm penetrates the second oocyte, this is where the baby begins to form. If fertilization does not control, the meiosis is not complete. The formation of the corpus luteum is our 5th step in the process. That happens around 24 days. This is where the follicle cells remain in the ovary. It secretes the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. In the event that a pregnancy does not occur, that the cell was not fertilized by the sperm, the corpus luteum disintegrates. If the cell did meet up with a sperm, then that's where the embryo, which is called the human chronic gonadotropin, develops. The final step in the ovarian cycle is menstruation, and that occurs on the first day of the uterine cycle. This is when the endometrium thickens, the corpus luteum disintegrates, and menstruation begins. A woman's uterine cycle varies. They vary between women. They vary between the amount of hormones in the body. So each month it could be different. And next, we will discuss the hormones that are involved in the uterine cycle. Our first hormone is estrogen. Estrogen is found in the ovaries, which are the follicle cells in the corpus luteum. It assists in the maturation of the egg, development and maintenance of female reproductive structures, secondary sex characteristics. It thickens the endometrium of the uterus in preparation for the embryo, and assists in cell division of breast tissue. Also involved is progesterone. It is also found in the ovaries, but in the corpus luteum only. It prepares the uterus for implantation of the embryo and maintains endometrium. The follicle stimulating hormone, also known as FSH, is also involved. It's in the inner pituitary gland, which is inside the brain. It stimulates development of the follicle in the ovary. And finally, we use the luteinizing hormone, also known as LH, and it's also in the anterior pituitary gland of the brain. And it triggers ovulation and causes the formation of the corpus luteum.